We've now moved on to the time period called adolescence, and first we'll be talking about the body and mind and the transitions that take place during this period that we call adolescence. Adolescence is an interesting time period because a lot of college students early in their careers, freshmen, sophomores, etc., um, are typically either in the end period of adolescence or in this relatively new um, transition area that's called emerging adulthood. When we talk about adolescence, we're usually talking about the beginning of puberty. Puberty is the time between the first onrush of hormones and full adult physical development. It typically lasts 3 to 5 years, and many more years are required to achieve full psychosocial maturity. So puberty is usually taken as the starting point for the beginning of adolescence, and there's of course some variability in there as always between when puberty actually begins, but that's usually the starting point for when adolescence starts, and so it's typically around the age of 11 or 12 with some differences for males and females. And for males, it's a little bit harder to tell when exactly puberty really begins, although there's a pretty salient feature of female puberty called menarche. And this is a girl's first menstrual period, signaling that she's begun ovulating and that pregnancy is now biologically possible. But ovulation and menstruation are often irregular for the first few years after menarche. So that's a clear demarcation for when puberty begins in females. As I said, we don't really have any clear demarcation of when it occurs in males, so that makes it a little difficult to try to compare males and females on things like the starting period of puberty. But one of the sort of almost not really equivalent, but one of the more similar experiences that males may experience is called sperm arc. This is a boy's first ejaculation. Erection can occur as early as infancy, but ejaculation signals sperm production. So that's typically one of the first things. It's not necessarily the first indication of puberty, but it's up there among the one of the more important events that can be taken as an indication. So what starts all this process? Well, basically our brain signals other glands in our body to start producing hormones. And hormones are organic chemical substances that are produced in one body tissue and conveyed via the bloodstream to another to affect some physiological function. So the main characteristics of how do we define a hormone? Okay, it's organic, it's a chemical, it's an organic chemical, it's produced in one body tissue, and it travels through the bloodstream where it will eventually reach its endpoint at some other place in the body, and it will result in a change in physiological functioning. So that's what a hormone is. Various hormones influence thoughts, urges, emotions, and behavior, in addition to the physical changes that take place. So this hormone production change that characterizes puberty typically starts off with the pituitary gland. Okay, we've seen the pituitary gland before. It's a gland in the brain that responds to a signal from the hypothalamus by producing many hormones, including those that regulate growth and control other glands, among them the adrenal and sex glands. So the adrenal glands, these are two glands located above the kidneys, and they produce a variety of different hormones, but in particular they produce the stress hormones, epinephrine or adrenaline, and norepinephrine, although the adrenal glands also produce testosterone in females. The HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, is the pathway of these different glands that results in the production of a large number of these hormones. So this is the sequence of a chain reaction of hormone production originating in the hypothalamus, moving to the pituitary gland, and then to the adrenal gland. So what happens is the hypothalamus releases one hormone, causing the pituitary gland to release another hormone, and keep in mind that these are traveling through the bloodstream when they go from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And then when the pituitary gland releases hormones, adrenocorticotropic hormone in particular, that travels through the bloodstream and causes the adrenal glands to release hormones. Another set of hormones, we have the gonads. These are the paired sex glands, so that's ovaries in females and testicles in males. And the gonads produce both hormones and gametes, and in particular, the hormones that we characterize as either androgen or estrogen types of hormones. And the estrogen hormones are typically considered female hormones, although males do produce some estrogen, and testosterone or androgens are typically considered the male hormones, although females do produce some testosterone as well, like I said. But there are gross asymmetries in the amount of production of these hormones. So estradiol, that's a sex hormone considered the chief estrogen in females, and females produce much more estradiol than males do. Testosterone, a sex hormone, the best known of the androgens, and playing a strong role, a significant role in male sexual behavior, as well as lots of other behaviors in both males and females. It's secreted in far greater amounts, though, by males than females. This chart, table 9.1 in our textbook, shows some of the different things that are going on for both females and males and the age point at which it starts. So we can see here that the ovaries increase their production of estrogen and progesterone around age 9, and then around age 9.5, the uterus and vagina grow larger. At age 10, the breast bud stage begins. Pubic hair then begins to appear, and the weight spurt begins about a year later. And keep in mind that these are rough approximations based on what's most typical when you take an average based on a large number of people, although there's going to be some variability around the averages always. And you can see that the peak height spurt occurs at about 11.5 for girls, although it doesn't begin until about age 13 for boys. So we can see some asymmetries here in terms of what the physical changes are in the body, when these hormones tend to be released, and also when males and females tend to become sexually mature. So at age 11 or 12, this is the most likely age of visible onset in terms of puberty. Again, it's very difficult to tell, particularly for males, when exactly it occurs, but we can start to see some visible signs at about age 11 or 12. The rise in hormone levels that signals puberty is still considered normal in those as young as 8 or as old as 14, and again, that's just that normal variability that we tend to see. And so we've got an average in there, but it's perfectly normal to have people both above and below the average. Precocious puberty, on the other hand, this is sexual development before age 8, occurs quite rarely, only once in about 5,000 children, for unknown reasons, and that's sort of where we demarcate what's considered to be abnormally early, for instance. About 2/3 of the variation in when puberty occurs is genetic. So this is based on family studies. We can see that the age at which it tends to occur for monozygotic twins is more similar than for dizygotic twins, which is more similar than for half-siblings and cousins, etc. Genes on the sex chromosomes have a marked effect on the age of puberty, and girls generally develop ahead of boys. So this is, of course, why we see that girls are typically taller than boys in the earlier grades, and then it's only later that boys start to catch up and then become ultimately taller than females as adults. Children who have a relatively large proportion of body fat tend to experience puberty sooner than do their thinner contemporaries. So this suggests that body fat percentage has something to do with when the onset of puberty occurs, although that's more so the case for females than it is for males. And in particular, a recently discovered hormone called leptin that affects appetite and is believed to be involved in the onset of puberty has helped to clarify, what the role of body fat is in the development of puberty. So leptin levels increase during childhood, and they tend to peak around age 12. And we see that in both sexes, chronic malnutrition delays puberty. And not only does it delay puberty, but chronic malnutrition in females can also cause a female to stop ovulating as well, or even having a menstrual cycle. So, data on puberty over the centuries has revealed a dramatic example of a long-term statistical increase or decrease. That's called a secular trend when you have relatively gross differences between populations of individuals at different points in time. So, the secular trend that we've been seeing is that each generation has experienced puberty a few weeks earlier and has grown a centimeter or so taller than did the preceding generation. Although this secular trend has stopped in developed nations, it was relatively substantial for a large number of years, and that did seem to be due to primarily nutritional factors. We also see some effects, some psychological effects on when puberty begins. If it occurs either too early or too late, there are different types of effects that can have depending upon whether you're a boy or a girl. So early maturing girls tend to have lower self-esteem, more depression, and poorer body image than later maturing girls for a variety of reasons. Early maturing boys, they tend to be more aggressive, law-breaking, and alcohol-abusing than later maturing boys. Slow developing boys tend to be more anxious, depressed, and slightly more afraid of sex. So there are different effects of when the occurrence of puberty has, again, depending upon whether we're talking about males or females. So as I mentioned, nutrition is an important part in terms of determining when puberty will actually occur, but it's important throughout the period of adolescence because many adolescents are actually deficient in their intake of necessary vitamins and minerals. It's important to keep in mind that you could be consuming plenty of calories, although if you eat something like McDonald's every day, you're getting lots and lots of calories. But what you're not getting is a well-balanced assortment of vitamins and minerals in your diet. And so we tend to see sometimes deficiencies of iron, calcium, zinc, and other minerals that can be more problematic during adolescence than vitamin deficiencies, since minerals are needed for both bone and muscle growth. And nutritional deficiencies, they result from the food choices that adolescents are allowed or even enticed to make. And when we say enticed to make, we mean having a McDonald's right across the street from a local school. It's not just random that McDonald's happened to pick that spot. That's a way of marketing to a particular population. And also the price of fast food is considerably lower than the cost of a healthy meal. And so these factors are having an effect on the types of nutrition that adolescents are actually getting. Another change that we tend to see is a change in a person's body image. This is a person's idea of how his or her body looks. Another reason for poor nutrition is anxiety about body image. In particular, girls are more likely to diet because boys tend to prefer to date thin girls. And in fact, girls think that boys want to date thinner girls than boys actually want. Likewise, boys want to look taller and stronger, a concern that increases from ages 12 to 17, partly because girls value well-developed muscles in males. And we also see an overestimation in males in terms of what they think that females are looking for them. Males tend to think that females want more muscular guys than they actually do. And so there's a bit of a distortion in both sexes' body images. And unfortunately, sometimes these distortions in body image can lead to eating disorders. And the two most common eating disorders are anorexia nervosa. This is an eating disorder. It's characterized by self-starvation. It's affected individuals voluntarily who voluntarily undereat and often overexercise, depriving their vital organs of nutrition. And anorexia can be very fatal. It results in extreme amounts of weight loss. Bulimia nervosa, on the other hand, is an eating disorder that's characterized by binge eating and subsequent purging, that is, getting rid of what you've just eaten, usually by induced vomiting and/or the use of laxatives. Now, although this doesn't tend to be quite as fatal, and people who develop bulimia nervosa tend to be close to a normal weight, there are still a lot of adverse side effects of both binging and purging, both psychological and physical to the body. So we see that there are along with the changes in puberty that we see that people get bigger and stronger, and this is particularly the case during the time of the growth spurt. The growth spurt is a relatively sudden and rapid physical growth that occurs during puberty, and each part of the body increases in size on a relatively set schedule. There's a weight increase that usually precedes a height increase, and then the growth of limbs typically precedes the growth of the torso. And so sometimes adolescents look like they've got relatively long arms or legs in proportion to their torso. A height spurt follows the increase in body fat, and then a muscle spurt occurs as well. And so they tend to look sometimes a little bit stockier at first because of the fact that this weight increase precedes the height increase. In terms of sexual maturation, it's important to differentiate between the two different types of changes that we see. We see changes in what are called primary sex characteristics, and these are called primary because they're directly related to or involved in reproduction. So this includes changes in the vagina, the uterus, the ovaries, the testicles, and the penis. Secondary sex characteristics, on the other hand, these are physical traits that are not directly involved in reproduction, but that indicate sexual maturity. Things like the growth of facial hair on a man or the development of breasts in a woman. These are secondary sex characteristics because they're not directly involved, again, in reproduction, but they do signal that puberty has taken place. So the primary and secondary sex characteristics just described, they're not the only manifestations of the sexual hormones. We also see changes in behavior and emotions as well. Things like fantasizing, flirting, hand-holding, staring, displaying, and touching all reflect gender availability and culture. So culture does have somewhat of an influence on the types of changes that we see. Hormones trigger thoughts and emotions, and thus the social context helps to shape these thoughts. Compared to 100 years ago, adolescent sexual development is more hazardous than it was back then, for 5 general classes of reasons. First, earlier puberty and weaker social taboos mean that teens have sexual experiences at younger ages, and early sex correlates with both depression and drug use. Secondly, most contemporary teenage mothers have no husbands to help them, whereas many teenage mothers a century ago were in fact married. Third, raising a child has become more complex and more expensive than it was 100 years ago. Mothers of teenagers are often employed and therefore less available as caregivers for their teenager's child, in part because of the increased expensiveness and complexity. And fifth, sexually transmitted infections are more widespread and dangerous today than they were 100 years ago. So fortunately, teenage births in the past 50 years have decreased quite markedly. We can see that there were 90 teenage births or teenage pregnancies for every 1,000 girls in 1960, but by the year 2006, that number was less than half, closer to 40. So fortunately, this is a good thing. That the number of teenage pregnancies has decreased, although unfortunately we can't say the same thing about the number of sexually transmitted infections. Okay, these are diseases that are spread by sexual contact, and they include things like syphilis, gonorrhea, genital herpes, chlamydia, and HIV. Another problem that we tend to see that tends to increase during puberty, as compared to prepubescent and postpubescence, we tend to see a higher rate of child sexual abuse. And child sexual abuse is any erotic activity that arouses an adult and excites, shames, or confuses a child, whether or not the victim protests and whether or not genital contact is involved. And there are a whole host of adverse effects that sexual abuse has on a child, both immediately and perhaps at times for the rest of their lives. We've talked about the differential growth of different brain areas before in adolescence. The limbic system, which is responsible or which is involved in the processing of fear and emotional impulses, tends to mature before the prefrontal cortex, which again does things like planning ahead and regulating our emotions. And what this means is that instinctual and emotional areas develop before the reflective ones do. And so, this likely has a role in some of the impulsive types of behavior or reckless types of behavior that we tend to see that are more characteristic of adolescence than other time periods in development. When emotions are intense, especially when one is with peers, the logical part of the brain shuts down. Either it shuts down or it's just overpowered by this more emotional component of the way that we process information. When stress, arousal, passion, sensory bombardment, drug intoxication, or deprivation is extreme, the adolescent brain is often overtaken by impulses that might shame adults. So they tend to be much more susceptible to engaging in far riskier behaviors, things that they would be far less likely to do later on in development after adolescence. Several aspects of the adolescent development, brain development, are positive, however. It's not all negative. They've got increased myelination, which decreases reaction time. They've got enhanced dopamine activity, which promotes pleasurable experiences. And synaptic growth enhances moral development and an openness to new experiences and ideas. Adolescents are quite capable of thinking about themselves, and in fact, they may even be thinking about themselves a little bit too much. This characteristic is called adolescent egocentrism. This is a characteristic of adolescent thinking that leads young people, between ages 10 and 14 approximately, to focus on themselves to the exclusion of others. They also tend to show what's called a personal fable. This is an aspect of adolescent egocentrism that's characterized by an adolescent's belief that his or her thoughts, feelings, or experiences are unique, more wonderful, or more awful than anyone else's, and that typically no one else would understand what that adolescent is going through, even though anybody who is an adult has already been through adolescence themselves. They also tend to fall victim to something called the invincibility fable. This is an adolescent's egocentric conviction that he or she cannot be overcome or even harmed by anything that might defeat a normal mortal, such as unprotected sex, drug abuse, or high-speed driving. In other words, they tend to discount the risks that are associated with these things. And a final characteristic that we tend to see is the imaginary audience. This is their belief that people are watching and taking note of their appearance, ideas, and behavior. And this, of course, makes many teenagers feel self-conscious because they believe that everyone who is around them is watching everything that they do. In terms of Piaget's theory, adolescence is the time when formal operational thought tends to take place, if it does take place. So in Piaget's theory, this was the fourth and final stage of cognitive development. It's characterized by more systematic logic and the ability to think about abstract ideas being things that are not present and are not tied in as well with something in the physical world. And this is closely related to the idea of hypothetical thought, which is reasoning that includes propositions and possibilities that may not reflect reality. So if I were to say, let's suppose that we made a law that, increased the drinking age from 21 to 25. What effect might that have, right? That's our ability to think about things hypothetically in order to think about what type of consequences a particular action might have. They're now able to engage in these two different types of reasoning called deductive and inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning is a type of reasoning where one goes from a general statement or premise or principle through logical steps to figure out or deduce specifics. So it's sometimes called top-down reasoning, and we'll see a diagram of this in a minute where it sort of looks like it's actually top-down reasoning. Inductive reasoning is reasoning from one or more specific experiences or facts to a general conclusion, and it may be less cognitively advanced than deduction. It's sometimes called bottom-up reasoning. So again, in inductive reasoning, we take our observations or our past experiences or our ideas that we maybe have heard from an authority, particularly in class or from parents and things like that, and we reach a general conclusion about things. Deductive reasoning is when we take a general principle and we're able to apply it or come up with examples or think about hypotheticals or come up with an extension of a general principle or even test an aspect of that general principle. Although they're capable of engaging in these higher modes of reasoning and thinking abilities, they don't always. Adolescents find it easier and quicker to forget about logic and follow their impulses. And this is called intuitive or emotional thinking. And the dual process model is the notion that there are these two networks that exist within the human brain, one for emotional and one for analytical processing of stimuli. Intuitive thought is thought that arises from an emotion or a hunch beyond rational explanation, and it's often influenced by both our past experiences and cultural assumptions. Analytic thought, on the other hand, is thought that results from analysis, such as systematic ranking of pros and cons, risks and consequences, possibilities and facts. Analytic thought depends on both logic and rationality. So intuitive thought is just sort of our gut reaction or how we feel about something. Analytic thought is more of a process where we really give something a lot of thought and try to assess what the different pros and cons, like I said, or risks and consequences of a particular behavior might be. And in secondary education and middle school, there tends to be a much greater emphasis on the former type of, or the latter type of reasoning here, the analytic thought. Okay, secondary education, this is the period after primary education, which is elementary or grade school, and before tertiary education. It usually occurs from about age 12 to 18, although the average range varies somewhat by school and by nation. But typically it would include both middle school and high school. Middle school is a school for children in grades between elementary and high school. And middle school typically begins with either grade 5 or grade 6, again depending on the particular school, and it typically ends with grade 8. Electronic technology has had quite an impact on cognition and the way that adolescents think. In particular, the most recent generations have been permitted to have access to electronic technology that their parents' generation may not have even heard of at the time that they were adolescents. And in the early 1990s, this is not so much the case now, but there was a digital divide. There was a gap between students who have access to computers and those who do not. Often a gap between rich and poor, since rich are more likely to have those technologies that tend to cost money than the poor do. In the United States and most developed nations, as I said, this gap has now been bridged due to the prevalence of computers in schools. The internet and other forms of electronic technology can certainly accelerate learning, but what they have to teach may not always be beneficial or trustworthy, for that matter. Adolescent growth benefits from both shared experiences and opinions, and this is certainly something that adolescents are very familiar with today, particularly with social media, such as Facebook, for instance. Facebook is believed to have a relatively positive impact on cognitive growth due to adolescents' ability to express their opinions there and engage in conversations. Often communication via the internet bolsters fragile self-esteem at times, and adolescents sometimes share personal information online without thinking about the possible consequences, and so that's a potential drawback of this new technology. Another potential adverse consequence of this technology, the development of digital media, is cyberbullying. Okay, this is bullying that occurs via internet insults and rumors, or it could be texting, anonymous phone calls, or even video harassment. Some fear that the anonymity provided by electronic technology brings out the worst in people. In other words, it's a lot easier to write a message to someone that can be very mean than it is to actually say that to a person. Or alternatively, if somebody doesn't know exactly who you are, that tends to disinhibit you from something that you might not otherwise do. Although this is not unanimously believed. One expert on bullying believes that cyberbullying is similar to other forms, but that it's just new in mode, not in terms of intent or degree of harm. In other words, the intent of cyberbullying or the intent of or the amount of harm that's caused by bullying is the same whether it's cyberbullying or just regular bullying in person. Entering a new school, this is a potentially difficult time for adolescents. The transition from one school to another often impairs a young person's ability to function and learn. Changing schools just when the growth spurt is occurring and sexual characteristics are developing is bound to create stress. The first year in any new school, whether it's middle school, high school, or even college, correlates with things like increased bullying, decreased achievement, depression, and eating disorders. In high school, in theory and sometimes in practice, high schools promote students' analytic ability, as I said. In the United States, an increasing number of high school students are enrolled in classes that are designed to be more rigorous and that require them to pass externally scored exams. Another manifestation of this trend toward more rigorous education is the greater number of requirements that all students must fulfill in order to receive an academic diploma. And these types of evaluations are called high-stakes tests. This is an evaluation that is critical in determining success or failure. A single test that determines whether a student will graduate or be promoted, that's what a high-stakes test is. And at the City University of New York community colleges, there used to be something called the CPE, the CUNY Proficiency Examination, that needed to be passed in order to move on from a community to a four-year college within the CUNY system. In the United States, one result of pushing almost all high school students to pursue an academic curriculum is that they're more prepared for college. Although, on the other hand, another result is that more students tend to drop out of high school. And if we look at some of the dropout rates, or at least those who have not completed high school, we see that there's been somewhat of a decline, although that seems to be somewhat dependent upon ethnicity. We can see that Hispanics have been consistently over the past 35 years far more likely to not complete high school than any of the other ethnic groups. Although overall, as I said, there is a trend toward decreasing likelihood that 18 to 24-year-olds will not have completed high school. And of course, likewise, there's an increasing trend that more and more students will be attending college.